So hello everyone, and welcome to the 5th session in the Antarctic Futures seminar series. We have people joining us today from all over the world, in person and online, and we've got some people here in person at the University of Wollongong as well. So good morning, afternoon or evening for our guests from wherever you are attending. My name is Dr. Melinda Waterman, and I am from the University of Wollongong. I'm actually a scientist who has visited Antarctic sites, and I've been researching mosses in different sites in Antarctica to see what they can tell us about the climate. And I will be introducing today's session and passing it on to Lucas, our host. So this session is being recorded and will be made available on the Antarctic Futures website. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of Dharawal country where we are meeting here today in person. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. So today's session is called Crazy Big Ideas, the Value of Science Fiction for Conceiving Antarctic Futures. We are pleased to have 3 speakers today who will spark discussion within the exhibition theme of Envisaging Antarctic Futures. Our 3 speakers are Dr. Lucas Eileen from the University of Wollongong, Dr. Hilary Strang from the University of Chicago, and David Spratt, who is a research coordinator for the Breakthrough National Centre for Climate Restoration. I'm happy to introduce Dr. Lucas Eileen, who is an artist, researcher, teacher in the creative arts at University of Wollongong, and he is a student at the Kandos School of Cultural Adaptation. He likes working with farmers and soil and inventors of interesting systems. In recent years, he's collaborated on many projects about carbon sequestration, sugarcane, Illawarra creeks, and sea level rise in China. So I'd like to pass this on to Lucas, who will introduce our other 2 speakers. Thank you, Lucas.
Thank you, Mel. And thanks so much for helping out with all of the coordination as conceptually, but also technically to make this possible. And to make it possible for me to sit here in a chair with very minimal technical devices in front of me so that I'm not distracted by the way that we usually teach at the university is you're doing all things at the same time. So it's a real privilege to be able to sit here and engage. But there is a hybrid situation. So we have people in the room in front of me, and we have our special guests on the screen, and then we have our people in the Zoom webinar who I can't see all your faces, but I trust that you're there and that and I will hear from you when you choose to make a text-based comment. And also, as Mel has said, we can have a voice conversation with you if you choose to. You can raise your hand using the appropriate button within Zoom, and Mel will keep an eye on that process.
Yes, definitely. So the Q&A option on your Zoom will allow you to type in questions at any time throughout today's discussion. And for those people in the room, you can raise your hand, as well as anyone who is online, you can also raise your hand if you'd like to ask your question verbally. Thank you for that reminder.
Thanks, Mel. So we set aside 12:30 p.m. till 2 p.m. at Wollongong time for this session, but I'm envisaging that we will be able to wrap up within an hour. We just let a bit of extra time in case the conversation runs over or we have technical issues and that kind of thing. But an hour is probably enough for us to get to the heart of the matter without tiring ourselves out too much. So here we are in Wollongong. We're on Dharawal country, Wadi people wanting to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land where this university is situated, and acknowledge the thousands and thousands of years of land and environment custodianship that we have inherited here in this place. And it's a relevant thing to think of in relation to today's conversation, because we're talking about what scientists often call environmental management. And as an artist, when I started entering the space of applying for grants to do these kind of projects about art and environment, I learned that there was this term environmental management, which I have come to use fairly unself-consciously, but often I butt up against the management side of things. The idea that we are kind of in this managerial relationship with our environment. And there are these other terms that we sometimes come into contact with, for example, through traditional owners, custodianship, through regenerative farmers. We hear about stewarding, these other kinds of terms that are a bit more about being in relationship with our more than human co-inhabitors of this planet. So we may at times use any combination of those terms: management, stewardship, custodianship, and all those kinds of things today. So I'm going to just introduce our two special guests, and my introductions will be fairly brief, and we can flesh them out as we go along based on if things come up that, you know, in terms of Hilary and David's backstory that we want to extend upon. But I'll just introduce them briefly. Hilary, I came across because I'm a fan of Kim Stanley Robinson's novels, and I listened to Hilary's podcast, which is called Marooned on Mars, which Hilary produces with Matt Hauschke. Is that how you say his name, Hilary?
Hauschke.
Hauschke. Okay, so Matt Hauschke, like myself, will be probably quite familiar with having his surname mispronounced. And it's a great podcast. It's what's called a read-along podcast. So Kim Stanley Robinson's novels are pretty big. You know, this Mystery for the Future is 600 pages. And so Hilary and Matt read a section at a time, and then so they stage out their period of time dwelling with the novel over several weeks. And so you can really dig into what's going on in the book in that particular section, as well as, you know, Hilary and Matt spin off into all sorts of discussions around the ethics of the plot, but also the literary form, in terms of like how Kim Stanley Robinson has structured his novels. They're often a little bit experimental in terms of what we might expect of the literary form of the novel. And Hilary also, in her spare time, works at the University of Chicago and runs the Master's Humanities program there when she's not spending time talking about Kim Stanley Robinson on the internet. Okay, and our other guest is David Spratt. And I came across David through a friend of mine, Damien Lawson, who works for the Greens Party, and recommended David as a person who, I remember actually years ago, Damien came back. David, you might not know this story, but perhaps around 2005, Damien came back and said, I'm not fun at parties anymore. And I said, why not? He said, well, I've been hanging around with David, and I've learnt about the climate emergency, and nobody wants to talk to me anymore at parties. So David is extremely knowledgeable about all this stuff, and he works at the Breakthrough Centre for Climate Restoration. His blog is called Climate Code Red. Terms like climate emergency and climate code red, David had a pivotal role in those terms becoming part of our cultural lexicon. David is, I learned last week, has a background in economics, but I would describe him as a convergent thinker, someone who's able to bring together lots of different kinds of fields of knowledge in a kind of, to synthesize things in a way that helps others of us who are more specialists to get a sense of the bigger picture. So that's just to give a bit of a sense of our two guests. So welcome, Hilary and David. I'm sitting here in the room, I'm looking up at this screen over here, which I guess helps me make eye contact with our people on the internet, but I'm also aware that sometimes I need to split my attention to the people in the room, so bear with me. And please shout out if there's any technical issues, if you can't hear me, or and Mel, you're keeping an eye on the comments. Okay, so our discussion today we've called Crazy Big Ideas, and to one extent it's just an opportunity for me to kind of nerd out with some people who have read Kim Stanley Robinson's work, or we should say people who have read Kim Stanley Robinson's work and who are fans. We call him Stan. So we might use that here today. So Stan has written lots of sci-fi novels, and the most recent one is this one, The Ministry for the Future. And then the other one that's relevant to our discussion today is this one called Antarctica, 1997 and 2020, I think, Ministry for the Future. And so because we're in this seminar series and exhibition, which is all around the theme of Antarctica, we have Brogan Bunt in the room, who's one of the coordinators of this whole program. And I said to Brogan, well, if you're doing a program about Antarctica, you've got to include Kim Stanley Robinson, because Antarctica is like a big part of Stan's books. And those of you who know me will probably be aware that I often bother people to read Stan's books. Oh, you should really, I'm part of a committee at the university called Energy Futures, and so I kind of hassle them to read Ministry for the Future as almost like a kind of blueprint for how we might act over the next 40 years or so. So what we're going to do is like think about some of the crazy big ideas that emerge from Ministry for the Future, and we've got Hilary here to help us do that. And then we're going to think about those in terms of their technical feasibility, or you know, what might be involved in those, and that's why we've got David here to help us with that. So we might start with Hilary, and perhaps for those of us in the room, maybe we could, I can't see the people on the internet, but I reckon we have more Stan fans on the internet than we do in the room. In the room, how many people have read Stan's books? We have one, so we've got about a 10% hit rate, no, maybe a 6% hit rate in the room for people having read Stan's books, but I reckon it'll be higher on the internet. Okay, so Hilary, this is over to you. You're the expert. Tell us about Stan. Tell us about, and let's focus specifically on Ministry for the Future and Antarctica. What do we get in these books?
Great. Well, so first of all, thank you for having me. Thanks to everybody who organized this. Lucas, thanks to you for inviting me. And I'm going to just sort of apologize because it is past my bedtime here in Chicago. So, you know, I'm maybe pretending to be a little bit more awake and focused than I actually am. So the first thing that I would say, I'm going to say, can I say some general things about Kim Stanley Robinson? And
yes.
then I'll say a little bit about maybe about Ministry for the Future. So for those of you who don't read science fiction, Robinson is probably is absolutely one of the most famous science fiction writers writing today. And this most recent book, Ministry for the Future, has gotten an enormous amount of publicity. And I'll say a couple more things about that. I would say that at the sort of core of what Robinson does is to give us really serious kinds of inquiry into like some of the big picture stuff of human living. So if when you hear science fiction, what you immediately think are kind of rocket ships and, I don't know, aliens or whatever it might be, lasers or phasers or whatever. Robinson's work is, I think, much more interested in asking questions about how it is that we human beings live with each other, and also how it is that we human beings live with non-human nature. And what are the sort of conceptions of non-human nature, and particularly of wilderness, that drive the ways in which we live with each other and in which we live on this planet that we live on. His most famous trilogy of books are set on Mars, and they dramatize the terraforming of Mars. But I would say that those books are really not at all about like a recommendation for leaving Earth and terraforming Mars, but rather a kind of inquiry into what our own relationship to our own planet is, what our sort of historical and political formations have to do with making our relationship to our planet, and also a really serious kind of questioning of what it would look like for us to live together and with the natural world in ways that are better, in ways that are more mutual, more cooperative, in ways that are not destructive, and in ways that allow for sort of the flourishing of human freedom, and also for the flourishing of the planetary world around us. So Ministry for the Future, which is Robinson's most recent novel, has been taken up, and I think this is a little bit the sort of the big ideas conceit here, has been taken up a little bit as a I don't know, like almost a kind of how-to manual or like a guidebook for how are we going to survive the current moment? How are we going to survive the climate emergency? What might we do? And I think there are, all of Stan's novels are full of sort of cool ideas. He himself is, I think, a very like polymathic person. He has a PhD in English. He is deeply interested in questions about narrative and how the ways that we tell stories shape the ways in which we view the world. But he's also somebody who's really interested in scientists and in the culture of science, and who puts a lot of effort into thinking about how it is that scientists do the work that they do. And what are the sort of constraints on the kinds of work that they do, and what are the sort of possibilities that science might get us toward, as well as what are the limitations on imagining science as sort of the sole driver of a response to something, like something like climate change. So Ministry for the Future is has a kind of narrative through line to it. And the narrative through line is kind of a love story. I mean, and I don't know whether Lucas is going to want to talk about that or not, but you might not think that a book that is primarily about imagining all kinds of responses to climate emergency would particularly care about questions about like how human beings meet each other, find each other, and the kind of affective relations that they develop with each other. But that is very much kind of part of the way in which Robinson's novels think, part of the way in which they work. Ministry begins with an extremely upsetting and intense and upsetting depiction of a heat crisis. And it goes from there into imagining the possibility for, under the heading of the UN, a ministry that would be able to coordinate responses to climate emergency globally. One I think very important feature of the way that the novel does this is that although we have at the center of the novel this UN agency and the bureaucrat who runs this agency, although that's at the center of the novel never tells us that the way in which we're going to get through this is because some benevolent international government agency is going to come and take over and solve our problems for us. Rather, it keeps making us ask about what it looks like to solve problems, what it looks like to attempt to solve problems. And I think it keeps making us ask throughout the novel about what the role of, the rest of us, those of us who don't particularly feel that we have access to power or maybe even all that much knowledge in the world, what our role is in relation to not just thinking about, but actually resolving the state of emergency in which we find ourselves. And I would say that since Ministry was published, so Ministry is set in the very near future. Since that novel was published, there seems to be some kind of shift in a general, at least media kind of sense that we are indeed in a climate emergency, not awaiting it, but already there. That I think the novel plays into actually quite well, because part of what it's interested in doing is asking, how is it that we, why would it be the case that we could already be in a state of emergency and not act like we are in a state of emergency? So maybe I'll sort of leave it there.
it's a great introduction to Stan's work and to the Ministry for the Future, and we'll bring in Antarctica as we need it. But you know, the Ministry for the Future is our kind of probably most pressing case study. And just to kind of reiterate for those who haven't perhaps caught on to this, the Ministry for the Future in the title of the novel is basically, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Hilary, is created by the United Nations as a sort of add-on to the, you know, associated with this kind of international climate panel on climate change, to represent or to what's the word, to advocate on behalf of entities that are yet to come into being in the present. So our grandchildren who are not yet born, or people who are coming to be in the future, who will be inheriting the world that we are creating for them. Those people don't have the ability to vote in our current elections, and yet they're the ones who are going to be affected. Not only people, also plants, animals, you know, geology, all this stuff that is going to be affected by our decisions. So that's a kind of, in some ways, that's the first crazy big idea of the novel, is the invention of this ministry whose job is to represent on behalf of the future. So that's well, maybe we could show my graph of crazy big ideas in the novel and how they map against Lucas's feelings, and then we'll turn to David for some analysis. I'm not sure if Mel's going to bring this up. So I'm not sure if you can see. Oh, you're doing the screen share now. So here are some of the crazy big ideas in the novel. So at the start of the novel, India goes through this gigantic heat wave and 20 million people die. This is really quite similar to stuff that's been going on in Pakistan recently. And the Indian government takes it upon itself to spray sulfur into the atmosphere without permission of the international community in order to reduce the possibility of this happening again. So there's crazy big idea number 2, geo-engineering, spraying sulfur into the atmosphere. And you can see that I've, on my little chart at the bottom of how Lucas feels about these things, that's down at the how I feel icky end of the scale, spraying sulfur into the atmosphere. And there's some, and we'll turn to David for some critique of my icky feeling in a minute, but there's some other ideas in there that we may or may not have time to talk about today, but you know, some important ones. This idea of eco-terrorism as a potential, or eco-tage as a potential approach to tackling climate change. And another one that I would love to talk about because it connects with our Antarctica theme, which is the idea of drilling into Antarctica to pump out the meltwater. And David also is familiar with some other Arctic and Antarctic intervention ideas that are currently floating around. So maybe at this point, David, we can bring you in and turn to you as someone who is familiar with some of these propositions and can kind of give us a sense of what's at stake and you know, which of these things might be feasible and why I shouldn't be feeling so icky about some of them. If you could stop the screen share, that we can see David's face bigger.
Thanks, Lucas. Well, look, the first big crazy idea is this, and this comes from paleoclimatology, that is climate history. It's well established that if the world were simply to maintain the current level of greenhouse gases, which is measured as parts per million, it's about 420 parts per million, if the world were simply to maintain that level of greenhouse gases in the long run, I'm talking, you know, centuries to 1,000 years, then past history will tell us two things. The sea levels will be up by at least 10 to 25 metres. In fact, in general terms, our paleoclimate history tells us that each 1 degree of warming, we're at 1.2 now, we're heading to 2 plus, probably 3, every 1 degree of warming produces a 10 to 20 metre sea level rise. And the first metre is the most damaging because 10 metres takes out every coastal city, every small island state, every rich alluvial delta in the world. I mean, that's the end of human civilization. The current level of greenhouse gases is enough for 3 degrees of warming, which national security experts for 15 years have been saying is existential. That is, it would produce the collapse of modern civilization and relationship between humans. So that's the first big crazy idea, that the current level, what we have already done, is civilization ending. The second big crazy idea that stems from that is that if we're going to be here, we have actually got to cool the planet. If we don't cool the planet, we won't be here. And there are two ways to do that. One is to draw down the existing carbon dioxide, for example, by reforestation, by machines, by all sorts of ideas. And the second one is that there are deliberate climate interventions to cool the planet now, because of the fear well established in what's called the hothouse Earth scenario, where the tipping points, which are now lining up, where various large elements of the climate system move from one state to a discretely different state, those tipping points are already tipping. The Amazon may be past its point of stability. We've just had papers saying Greenland is past its point of system stability. In 2014, the IPCC said they couldn't assess what was happening in Antarctica. A quite reticent assessment. At the same time, a great paper by Eric Rigno came out saying we can see that certain glaciers in Antarctica in 2014 have already passed their tipping points. That is, you do not need to put any more energy into the system for these glaciers to melt, and that's been reaffirmed last year and again this year. So we're in a crazy situation where you need to cool the planet in order for human civilization to be here. And because of what's happening in Antarctica, you need to find ways to try and stop those glaciers melting while you cool the planet, because the first 1, 2, 3 meters of sea level rise will destroy coastal civilization.
Links back to the idea in Stan's book about drilling down to the bedrock of Antarctica to suck out the meltwater. And the idea that's dramatised in the book involves, it stems from the idea that all the Antarctic ice is sitting on bedrock, and if it slides into the sea, then that giant mass creates massive sea level rise. So how do you stop that happening? In the book, it explains that, you know, there's meltwater that's reaching the bottom of the bedrock, which is causing the glacier to kind of float. It lubricates the gigantic ice block and helps it kind of slide into the sea faster. So part of the narrative of the book involves the scientists kind of brainstorming this crazy big idea and kind of coming to terms with the fact that it's like so outrageously expensive, but to do this, but at the same time, you know, we can't afford not to do this. So the water is sucked up off the bedrock and sprayed onto the top of Antarctica, where it refreezes, taking away that layer of liquid water at the bottom, which then helps the glacier to kind of sit back down on the bedrock and stop it and slow its kind of sliding into the sea, which then potentially buys us a bit of time to sort out all the other stuff around carbon drawdown and emissions and so on and so forth. So, David, talk to us about these kinds of crazy big geo-engineering ideas.
Okay, there's 10 or a dozen of them. We could go, that would take a long time. I mean, the biggest one and the most controversial is when you get a volcano, it puts a large number of what are called sulfates in the atmosphere, which produces temporary cooling. We've seen this. And in fact, when we burn fossil fuels, we also put sulfates into the atmosphere. So in burning fossil fuels and pushing up the carbon dioxide levels, we're also producing a temporary masking with all these sulfates. And as you stop using fossil fuels, the sulfates disappear and the rate of warming increases, which is an irony that most people in the climate movement don't want to admit to. So we are now facing accelerated warming due to less fossil fuel use, particularly cleaning up dirty coal. So that's the big proposition.
David, can I stop you there, because I didn't actually understand. Could you say that again, but
okay.
A bit slower, because I didn't follow.
When you burn fossil fuels, a byproduct are sulfate aerosols, sulfur dioxide, which goes in the atmosphere and cools the atmosphere for 1 week before it's rained out. So this is what Jim Hansen, the great NASA scientist, called our Faustian bargain. In putting all this carbon dioxide up there, we're also providing a temporary mask for some of the warming by these aerosols, but they only last a week. Now, we know this is the case because when you have a volcano, it spews out large amounts of aerosols. The last time was Mount Pinatubo, which produced perhaps a degree of warming for a decade because of all this stuff in the atmosphere. So one of the ideas is that you put some of those sulfates, which are currently being put up by dirty coal-fired power stations, up in the atmosphere to provide cooling. In terms of Antarctica and the poles, there are two more specific things. One is a thing called marine cloud brightening, which is to make clouds whiter or to form new clouds to reduce the amount of heat coming through the atmosphere. And this is actually being investigated in Cambridge at the moment, led by a guy called Sir David King, the former chief scientist for the UK. And they're looking at it to try and cool the Arctic, because the Arctic is undergoing rapid change. Greenland is melting, the Gulf Stream is cooling, and he says we have got 3 or 4 years to try and get this idea to be feasible, or it will be too late. And in fact, they're starting to do experiments on the Great Barrier Reef to try and increase the cloud cover of the Great Barrier Reef to reduce the amount of heat under the clouds and save the coral system in the short term. The more relevant one is in Antarctica. When a glacier, as you said, is grounded on bedrock, when the bedrock finishes, you're at the edge of the ocean, and then a large ice shelf protrudes. The glacier continues over the ocean and down the ocean, perhaps a couple of kilometres high. And what's happening is that warmer oceans, warmer water due to climate change is getting under the ice shelf and eating away at it, so that water is now getting under between the ice sheet and the bedrock, and that's what's leading to this really rapid sliding. And one of the ideas is that there are very narrow valleys on the edge of the ice shelf where the water is intruding, and the idea by John Moore and others is to put what they call a seabed curtain, which is like a flexible device anchored into the rock that would be maybe 2 or 3 kilometres wide, because that's where these valleys are that the water is protruding into. Put in these curtains to slow the rate at which the water is getting under the glaciers and destabilising them. So that's sort of that's not quite Kim's idea. Same result with a different process.
Okay, so thanks, David. So lots of questions arising from this, and we may have, I don't know if we have any questions coming through from our. So as a sort of gentle greenie, some of these ideas seem like, these interventions seem, I don't know how you might say them, like a little bit violent or a bit kind of extravagant or something. Like, David, why, you know, so tell me why, like what about, you know, what might go wrong with, you know, we here in Australia, we're familiar with environmental interventions, like the classic being the cane toad, and how we think that when we intervene with good intentions, often these things kind of stuff up and have worse consequences. Well, so is that relevant in this case?
Yes, but the fact is that, you know, hands-off nature is no longer relevant. We have destroyed nature. Climate change has destroyed nature. The Arctic, I mean, serious people will tell you that the Arctic ecosystem no longer exists. It's already been destroyed. So we can't go back to the 19th century and say we're sitting in a little log cabin and we're going to keep our hands off. We have destroyed nature by and large. And the question, so the idea of hands-off nature is not going to preserve the Antarctic ice sheet. It's too late for that. And so the question I ask all the time, because people say, oh, this is dreadful, there are all these problems and risks. Yes, there are risks. The biggest risk at the moment is the existential risk that civilization will end because of what we have already put into the atmosphere. That's the risk. And so the question to me all the time is, what is the least, there are no good options. What is the least worst option? And I would say trying to stop several meters of sea level rise, which will destroy a whole lot of states, flood most of Bangladesh, destroy the world's alluvial deltas, by whatever means seems reasonably safe, is a better idea than throwing your hands up and say, there's nothing I can do.
Yeah. Okay, David. So you can see here why I've got a few questions coming here. You can see here why my friend Damien said that he wasn't fun at parties anymore after talking to David. So we've got a question in the audience here from Brogan, and then one from the back, I think. Okay.
I totally agree with the.
Can you let us know if you can hear Brogan's voice out in Zoom land?
I mean, I totally agree with the point that we can't, hands-off nature is just no longer relevant. My question is, as long as the current system, which includes global inequities at the level of wealth, all sorts of things, access to health, as well as as long as the global system that's actually producing this heat is still here, you're only putting a band-aid on if you just put this curtain along. You have to address that fundamental systemic issue, or you're just playing around at the edges again.
David.
I couldn't agree more. Nobody, I wasn't asked a question about what the systemic solutions were, which might be another Zoom seminar or 10. I'll just be brief in saying that, I mean, obviously the world is in systemic avoidance of the problem at the moment. The world thinks that there is a non-disruptive path out of this, and there isn't. We now face a choice. We can pretend to go on with free market capitalism and everything will be all right and net zero 2050 and no disruptive change, and the system will collapse. That's one choice. Not acting and society will collapse. The other option is to intervene radically in ways which are not politically acceptable at the moment, by actually acknowledging that we can't keep on using more and more resources, that the state needs to intervene decisively based on public mobilisation intervention and do things entirely differently. So we have got a choice of two disruptions. There is no disruptive path, which is the current paradigm.
Satisfied, Brogan?
I guess the background issues that you have to have is how you, and this is, I guess, in the future, how you get some sense of social consensus to actually have agency and act. And I'm not convinced that the UN would find any kind of umbrella to do that whatsoever. And then I think that if you've got areas of the world where people are profoundly poor and need access to healthcare and need to run generators to get things, you know, have even the most basic living standards, there's a sort of local ethics that's different than the global ethics, and there are all sorts of conundrums about how you actually get agency at an international level to address the genuine systemic problems. Okay,
so Brogan's question, in a way, I mean, David, you've been talking about the what needs to be done, and Brogan's question goes to the how. Because it's all very well to say, we know what to do. Stop emitting, draw down, do repairs. Seems so simple, but because we are social creatures, and social creatures by, you know how hard it is to make decisions even within your own household, or within the level of a school, at a university or something like that. How do we come together and make decisions together? Antarctica is a pretty interesting case study in many of Stan's books, because it's an area of shared jurisdiction, a bit like the whole planet. Like, no country has control over Antarctica. It's a kind of uneasy, tension, shared environment. And so in many of Stan's novels, it plays this role. It's like a theatrical set for thinking, how can humans come together and make these kind of shared decisions? So it might be worth turning to Hilary at this point and saying, like, let's talk about jurisdiction and let's talk about the how. You know, how does Stan help us to think about those things that David says we need to do? And we'll come back to your question at the back of the room in a minute. Sorry to...
Yeah, I mean, I don't, there's of course like a risk in sounding like you're saying something trivial when you're talking about climate emergency, and you say, well, I think you should read more science fiction, but just a moment, like go with that. I mean, so one thing that we could ask is, like, When we and I think actually that these are questions that Stan's novels pose and help us think about in serious ways. One thing we could ask is, why is it the case that when we are thinking about climate emergency, certain things sort of pop out at us as big ideas, right? And other things don't pop out at us as big ideas, right? So why is it the case that a question like the one that we just had, right, which is about like, how do you go about producing decision making so that you are not looking at sort of unilaterally made decisions, right? Or so that you are making sure that whatever kinds of like attempts or experiments are being made are being done, with like serious thinking about like an entire kind of like network of possibilities and consequences, right? So it might be the case that like asking those kinds of questions, right, that we need those big ideas, as much as we need big ideas about like, emergency responses to sea level rise, right? And it might be the case that, the biggest idea of them all is one that I actually think, however much, in some ways, Ministry for the Future is a book that I think one reason that people have liked it is that at least one reading of it makes it feel kind of consoling, because there is this feeling that it's possible to read it, and I would have a kind of different interpretation, but it's possible to read it and think it's saying like, hey, well, you know what? Maybe the UN is going to step in and rescue us. And like, maybe just like some hardworking bureaucrats who just like really stick to it and, are willing to run with some crazy ideas will be enough, right? I suspect that is not really what that book is saying, right? And part of what I think it's actually trying to do is to get us to think about things like, why do we think that we have no agency, or why is our picture of what agency in response to climate emergency why is what that picture looks like so much like, oh, we have to have some experts who are going to take care of this for us. Now, this is not to diminish the role that science is going to have to play, right? And like whatever I might think about that, absolutely Stan's novels think that is sort of like central. But that role gets played not in some kind of vacuum, right? However much these novels may stage problems in imaginary spaces, like they never let you imagine that the world is a vacuum in which you can do something in one place and it won't matter in another place, or in which just one person can figure out how to do something, get it done, and once they've gotten it done, transformation follows, right? Everything has to happen everywhere all at once is part of what Ministry for the Future says, and that everything all at once also is about like, how are people actually living their very ordinary lives, and what are the transformations that have to happen in their very ordinary lives? Something that I think Ministry does quite well it is to not soft pedal, like is both to say like, there's all kinds of stuff about us as humans that is absolutely not dependent on the way at least we in the global north live under capitalism, right? We have all kinds of qualities, all kinds of possibilities for thriving lives that are not dependent on the stuff that we have, right? But it also doesn't soft pedal the fact that like, in order to get through this, right, in order to make a livable world, to remake a livable world, we're going to lose a lot. And that's a lot of what that book is kind of asking us to think about. And I think these kinds of things, to me, like, it's not only that there are questions, these sort of more technical questions about what it looks like to produce mass mobilization. I think they're also kind of philosophical and even like affective, like feelings-based questions that we do sort of have to wrestle with and contend with at the same time as we're thinking about the rest of the conditions of the emergency around us. I don't know if that is to say, I think that like big ideas might look like all kinds of things, and we all need to be having them. And that for me is a sort of lesson that I take from reading Robinson's novels like over and over again.
Thanks, Hilary. And Just sort of thinking about this question of the how, and this idea, this fantasy, I suppose, that the United Nations is going to come in and help us solve the problem. I mean, that in a way, like one of the main characters in the book, Mary, who's the chair or the boss of the Ministry for the Future, she has to come to terms herself with the fact that the ministry has limited capacity and relies on this thing called the shadow ministry. Well, it's not called anything, they just give it that name because it's basically the kind of black wing shadow kind of operation that does eco-terrorism, and one of her offsiders, Badim, is kind of in charge of this, and she's not allowed to know about what it does, but it has this kind of whole kind of direct action, violence agenda, which I guess it just really throws into, as a reader, I am constantly grappling with the ethics of this kind of stuff. And, talking to David and Hilary has helped me to kind of realize that disruption is not an option, that's a given. So, what flavor of disruption do we want? Violence is not an option, it's a given. We already perform violence every day through our kind of the invisible actions of our lives under capitalism. So, what's our next conscious choices around how we might kind of come to terms with our nature as violent actors on this planet? Is your question at the back of the room still burning?
I mean, yeah, it's connected to the previous question.
I'll just check if could you, Hilary and David, as our next questioner asked her question, can you just let us know if you can't hear her clearly?
So mine is also for David, connected to the previous question. Like, I can understand and also support temporary environmental engineering, and I know that that's how a lot of climate scientists see it as well. But do you think that there is a risk that companies and people that currently earn a lot of money from the things that cause climate change might then use environmental engineering, such as like the sulfuric spraying into the atmosphere, as like a kind of defense to then not do the action against the things that cause climate change?
Oh, yeah, look, that's obviously a big question, and it's clear that geo-engineering climate interventions are only efficacious if they're combined with a program to cool the system more broadly, to get to zero fast, to draw down back to safe levels. So yes, that's absolutely correct. But not doing anything because it's dangerous is not an option either. I mean, when you think about Australia and Antarctica, I mean, we are an Antarctic partner. People in the audience have been down there. We have bases there. Australia has a duty of care. This is a question in terms of agency which has never been raised to my knowledge. Australia has a duty of care directly in relation to Antarctica. And the first question I would ask the Science Minister or the Climate Minister or the Foreign Affairs Minister is, do we have a duty of care to protect the Antarctic glaciers? Does our political system have a duty of care? Does the United States government has a duty of care? It's an Antarctic partner as well, to protect those glaciers. And what's it doing about it? And the answer is nothing. So there is a path there. I mean, I think the other thing to a little bit more broadly, to come back to what Hilary was saying, I mean, Stan is really relevant because we now have to talk about possibilities rather than probabilities. Science, as we know, quantitative science is based on the probabilities, the most likely things happening, 50% chance of this, things in the middle of the probability distribution. When risks are existential, and this is the question we have to ask now, when risks are existential, the question is, what's the worst possibility that could happen and how do we stop it? So we actually have to move from a science which is probability focused to asking, what are the possibilities? What are the bad possibilities? And this is a view that many, I mean, scientists will say to me privately, the International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change should be closed down because it's no longer relevant. So we should be doing scientific, and people have advocated this, for scientists to come together and do the science of the bad possibilities rather than the science of the probabilities. I mean, John Schellenhuber, the former head of the Potsdam Institute, who advised Angela Merkel and the Pope, said to us, and he wrote an introduction to a report we did, and he said, when the issue is the survival of civilization, conventional means of analysis may become useless. Now, that's a profound thing, because if we're talking about a path forward, then we need a different means of scientific analysis that is based on existential risks, not conventional risk management. So if you say, are the institutions fit for purpose? No. The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change has produced 27 COPs, and the situation's got worse every year. We've got an IPCC which is so reticent, it's no longer relevant. We need different institutions that understand that the risks are existential and focus on the possibilities. That is something that we have not done, and that's why we fail.
Oh yes, sorry, I think I was muted for a second there. So we're in a way we're talking about a crisis of storytelling. If science is through the IPCC, because there's this published report that comes out every few years about the state of the environment, and what you're saying, David, is that it's reticent to tell us the reality of the extreme possible risk that we face, and it waters down that risk. Because the various members of the IPCC have the right to veto certain clauses or sentences that might be too alarmist or too dramatic.
Members as in the political ambassadors who sign off on the summary reports, not the science, but the ambassadors, the political appointees.
So, but this is in some ways, that IPCC report is a kind of story that the planet tells itself about the state of reality. And if we have a crisis in that story, we then, I guess, you know, Hilary, we have the possibility with a book like Ministry for the Future to tell that story in a way that allows it. I mean, as a reader, when I'm reading this book, you know, it goes for 600 pages, so I'm able to inhabit this world. It's the same world as we're currently living in, but then it starts, you know, today, and then it stretches out over the next 30 to 40 years, I guess. And it allows me to kind of imagine, you know, the script changing, the score changing. In some ways, it's almost like you know, a kind of forum theatre where somebody comes up on the stage and changes the score. And then, and when you live in that alternative possible future, where all those awful things come to pass, but at the same time, humans somehow manage to find ways to tackle them, it does somehow, it has this capacity to reprogram your mind to think about how things can be different, compared to when you read the IPCC report. And my options as a non-specialist are either to go, everything's going to be okay, the experts will solve it for me, or I'm doomed, I might as well just go put my head in the sand or something like that. So Hilary, science fiction has this alternative storytelling capacity.
Yeah, I think you know, the way that I would describe what science fiction does is so a book like Ministry for the Future, which takes place in the very near future, has a sort of quality of, I mean, and I think has been read by a lot of people as doing this, of seeming like something like an extrapolation from our present, you know, like let's sort of game out a bunch of scenarios, see how they might play out, and you know, like let's proliferate kinds of possibilities. But it seems to me that what science fiction does more than that is to sort of cast you, the reader, back into your own moment, right? So what you experience when you start reading a science fiction novel, like the one thing that I think everybody can agree on about science fiction is that the science fiction novels take place in worlds that are in one way or another different from our own. And in the case of science fiction, different from our own in a way that we can make sense of. So in a science fiction novel, we come in contact with stuff that feels new to us, but not inexplicably so, right? New in ways that we are able to get some kind of cognitive purchase on, just as we sort of develop an emotional relationship to that kind of newness. That sort of contact with newness or with difference, or even in the case of something like Ministry, of a kind of like a picture of possibility, right? And a big part of what that book does is to give us a picture of human cooperation, planetary human cooperation toward something better, right? Getting that picture of something different offers us a way to, I think, experience stuff that is missing for us in our own moment. And to begin to think in some ways that are, I think, surprisingly concrete about why it would be that this stuff that we experience as different, as new, perhaps as frightening, perhaps as icky, like on your chart, right? But maybe as desirable, right? Like when we come in contact with that stuff, like that allows us to ask serious questions about the stuff that we are in many ways precluded from noticing in our everyday lives, precisely because our lives revolve around reproducing the everydayness of our lives, right? I mean, our lives involve us getting up in the morning and doing what we need to do for ourselves and for the people who we care for in order to be able to go to work or go to school or whatever it is you do, and get back home at the end of the day and do the same thing again the next day. And what science fiction does is let you reflect on that stuff that just seems like normal, everyday, and unchangeable, right? And if you start reflecting on the here and now in a way that lets you see it not as unchangeable, but as made, as historical, as made by human beings, as to some extent made by all of us, I think that is one way in which you can begin to get the kind of glimpse that we honestly, I think, badly need of the possibility of us making something different. So that is a general description, I think, of what science fiction does, that kind of estrangement from our here and now that lets us understand something about the here and now. And that is very much a description of what I think Robinson's novels do really, really beautifully. I think they're always like, even Ministry for the Future, which, is full of these, like, it has modern monetary theory in it. It has like the idea of a carbon coin. It has, as you said, this deeply ambiguous sort of central figure of the ministry that also has this like shadow wing to it. None of those things, would I say, need to be sort of presented as like, oh, I'm reading this book in order to like get a list of solutions that I might be into, although some people might be into some of those solutions. But together they begin to give us like some sense of like, first of all, the kind of the scope of what might need to change. And secondly, like what is profoundly not here for us right now that we need in order to be able to make things different. And in an urgent way too,
Hilary, that's great. And yeah, there's whole sections in the book about monetary theory, which you mentioned, like the systems that we have are invented and therefore they can be reinvented. And Stan reminds us of that in that book where he kind of does this little historical digression to tell us that about the invention of the banking system 500 years ago. It didn't exist before that. Now we think it's eternal and unchangeable, but it was a human invention. So we do have another question, but I'm aware that I've been neglecting our Zoom people. So can we talk to them first?
Yes, there's quite a lot of questions online, so thank you for typing them in the Q&A box. I'm hoping I'm going to ask these questions in order. So I have a question from Michael Griffiths. He says, Dipesh Chakrabarti, I don't know if I pronounced that name right, over 10 years ago, pointed out that the humanities were ill-equipped to deal with climate change. Here you're pointing to a sci-fi novel as potentially instructive for dealing with climate change. What does a climate-conscious humanities look like? Possibly one for you, Hilary, and David, if you'd like to follow up.
Yeah, I mean, I think that essay by Dipesh Chakrabarti is actually, well, I'm hearing like a lot of, I'm getting some like sound interference. I think that essay that the questioner referenced is actually quite an interesting essay. I mean, I teach environmental humanities classes, and I always think that part of what we're there to do, and part of what my students and I do in those classes, is try to ask really directly, like, what work in the humanities, or really actually what academic work in general could possibly have to do about climate change, right? You know, is there stuff that we do in spaces like seminar rooms that matters to this situation that we're in, this situation, which is a situation of emergency? And I think the answer is kind of a little bit of a yes and no. One reason that I kind of fall on the side of science fiction as being a good place to sort of think is because honestly, I think people actually like reading science fiction, unlike most academic humanistic writing. And I say this as a, you know, academic humanist. And, you know, when I was just talking about what it is that science fiction does, like its capacity for estrangement that I think is extraordinarily productive, like that can happen to you when you're reading one of the, you know, you're reading a novel by, you know, Kim Stanley Robinson or Ursula Le Guin or whoever it is on your own. But even better is it gives you a way to talk to other people about this stuff. And, you know, this is always the fallback of the humanities. I think that this is only one teeny tiny piece of what needs to be done. But I do think that figuring out ways to talk and think with other people about hard problems is enormously important. And I think that science fiction can facilitate that. And I think it has the capacity to facilitate that in a way that can offer us also a certain kind of hope that I think is really necessary. I mean, I think we need hope in order to build mass movements, just as I think we need hope in order to be able to, like, you know, whatever, get through the day and not bury our heads in the sand. So that's a kind of, I think that's a big question. That's my kind of like half answer to it.
Lucas,
it's a great answer.
Lucas,
yep, David.
I don't work in the humanities, I don't work in the universities, but what strikes me is that is the failure which the questioner pointed to. I mean, climate policy making is constructed within a certain paradigm. It's a paradigm of catastrophic failure at a global level and also at a national level. What disturbs me is that I see political science and environmental courses, humanities environmental courses, uncritically reproducing this stuff, not challenging it. I mean, the number of courses about the UNFCCC and climate policy making that just deny what's going on. I think the universities have failed to have any critical imagination about saying, what is this paradigm? What is this orthodoxy? Why has it failed? And what would a different paradigm be? And I think in that academic humanities have failed. I mean, it is a question of the possibilities away from the orthodoxy. This is what science fiction, this is what Stan gives us. The thinking about the possibilities on the edge rather than the orthodoxies, the probabilities in the middle. And I don't see that humanities have apart from science fiction, have done much to explore those possibilities. I mean, people are caught in the minutiae of policy making rather than understanding its catastrophic failure.
Here of a program where there's an exhibition connected to Antarctica, and you know, we could say Stan's work is in the humanities, but it's also in the creative arts. So there is a sort of you know, parallel stream there that I belong to, and many others here in this room, where we have in some ways a kind of strange disciplinary permission to operate on those fringe imaginaries of possible futures without getting into disciplinary trouble the way that a scientist might do. So thanks for those answers, both of you. We have I'm just aware we're over our 1 hour time. We have a few more questions. If everybody's happy to have a few more, then we'll see how we go. Thanks. Mel?
Excellent. Thank you very much for those answers. So we have another question. This one's from Lizzie. She loves the idea that sci-fi can make the unthinkable thinkable and shape public sentiment to create political change. But ministry sometimes feels like West Wing for the eco age, i.e. a comforting fiction of righteous, smart people who prevail against the odds. I haven't finished it though. She said this, maybe they don't prevail. I'm not sure who I should address that one to.
Well, David was chuckling.
Oh, look, I mean, we're now in a disruptive, a really uncomfortable place. And I was just thinking, I mean, if you've got these orthodoxies and we were talking about, you know, changing the story, changing the narrative, if you look politically in the last 5 or 6 years, I mean, the people who've changed the climate conversation have been people who've made the world feel uncomfortable. Greta Thunberg, for one, who I think has done an enormous amount, you know, and what's followed from her, and also Roger Helmer and XR in really challenging people about the nature of the problem. And these are people who've stood outside of the paradigm and really said, here's a different story. And I think Stan and science fiction play a similar role of making people feel uncomfortable. If people think Stan's bright-siding a bit with the Ministry for the Future, so be it. I mean, there's an endless debate about fear and hope. I don't go into either of them because I think both are necessary. And I say not fear or hope, but courage. But that's just my personal view of things. We need to feel really uncomfortable in order to change, and that's why I think that people like Greta and XR have done a great job in changing the conversation and at least starting to stir up and fracture the paradigm.
Thanks, David. We have a question from within the room here.
Thanks. I would like to just put my experience in reading the IPCC report out there because a lot of people I talk to avoid reading it because they don't want to feel icky. But my experience was it was quite motivational. And if people aren't willing to go to that place where they might feel uncomfortable, then they avoid, then they're putting their heads in the sand. So I just want to put that out there. Read the IPCC report. It's very motivational. And I definitely have this book on my reading list.
Yeah, great.
Thank you.
Thanks for that counterpoint about the IPCC as a motivational text. That's great. Do we have, Mel, another online comment? I'm just wondering how many more we have because we should start kind of winding up, I think.
We have one. Or probably 2 questions.
Okay.
So one
All
seems like a longish one, so
yeah.
I'll get to that one first.
Wait, Mike, I'm looking at it out of the corner of my eye. It's like my question has 3 parts and then it turns into more of a comment. But we'll keep our responses brief as well.
Yeah, we'll see. So if you can't keep up with me, panelists, please have a look at the Q&A. So this is a question from Andrew Kelly. After reading the book, the yawning gap is the agreement and execution of an overarching global plan. Rather, we seem to be long-term subscribers to the notion of Adam Smith's invisible hand. We seem to be living in hope that business investment, scientific research, Paris Agreement targets, and innovation will self-organise in time to avert disaster. Stan, Bill Gates, John Doerr have all penned plans. Does the panel see any comprehensive plans on the horizon? And which bodies do you reckon could be charged with enacting or executing? From Andrew Kelly, the Antarctic Science Foundation.
Thanks, Andrew. Hilary and David, who would like to tackle that one?
I mean, one thing I just would sort of throw out there about ministry for the future is something you might read that book, and this also I think responds to the previous question. Something you might read that book and take away is actually how very, very far away we are from having any kind of international agency under the heading of the UN or otherwise that could do the things that we see the Ministry for the Future doing. And again, I think you might also take away from reading that novel that this international quasi-governmental agency only is able to achieve what it's able to achieve because along with it goes a wave of what is probably properly called eco-terrorism. Like, those things might make us think that the project of the book or the questions that it wants us to ask are a little bit less obvious than sort of like, oh, here's a model for the way in which change could get done, right? It seems to me sort of worth acknowledging that another thing that happens in that book, and that I think is probably really important to think about, is, David already said, cited like Extinction Rebellion and Greta Thunberg, and there are people all over the world. I am thinking of Native and Indigenous people here in North America who are doing blockades and other forms of defense against pipelines. There are people all over the world who are, taking on the sort of the flows that are responsible for climate change in direct kinds of ways. And I don't, my own feeling is there's not going to be I don't think that our solution is going to come to us at the level of, governments that are beholden to capitalism and to the corporations that have essentially benefited and will continue to benefit from, the situation that we live in. I think the only solution is going to come elsewhere, from a liberation from those things. And I would say that, some of Kim Stanley Robinson's novels back me on that opinion, even if Ministry maybe doesn't exactly.
Yeah, I agree. The climate policy orthodoxy is that markets will prevail and markets will solve the problem, and they have clearly failed to do so and will continue to fail to do so, and that's why we've got the crisis. There's these constant techno market fixes like carbon capture and storage, carbon taxes, which have all failed. That's the reason why we're heading towards an existential crisis. And as Stan makes clear, the alternative to the market prevailing are state institutions, whether they be at a national level or at a global level. The Ministry for the Future. The Ministry for the Future is not a market solution. It's a state leadership, a global institutional leadership, and that's the fundamental question that has to be resolved, and it's got to be resolved in the opposite manner to the way it is at the moment.
So I think we'll just have one final question, and then we'll briefly respond and wrap up. What have you got for us, Mel?
Oh, there are so many good ones. I think I might go to Damien's question. He's asked, how will traditional conservation or environmental ideas help or hinder the possibility of intervention in Antarctica?
Well, here's the problem. Let me only speak in Australia, but also internationally, in that almost every traditional, the climate movement, the official climate movement, the NGOs come out of the environmental movement. So they have a nature conservation paradigm, by and large, which is hands-off nature. And I said at the beginning of the program, that's now out of date. So they in Australia are largely opposed to climate interventions. So when you say this intervention, these are the people who talk about climate justice and saving Pacific Island states. When you say this intervention might stop a sea level rise, they go, oh, no, hands off nature, we're opposed to climate intervention. So these people are in a deep moral crevasse where they can't think straight. And they are essentially the enemy when it comes to climate intervention these days.
And I think I guess we dramatised that a little bit, David, when I said, I guess I'm down the icky end of these kinds of interventions as well. So these kinds of conversations are what challenge our orthodox views of what it is to be an environmentalist. And I don't think that we're presented in the novel with easy solutions.
Yes, but to be an environmentalist in 2 or 3 decades, you actually have to have humanity left on the planet. And if you don't pursue the policies that allow humanity to be here, you won't be an environmentalist.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think, I mean, this was, I'm pretty sure this was a question from our friend Damien, who's no fun at parties. So he's kind of, he's fed you that line there, David. And I think it's, you know, it's really, this is, I mean, this is, I guess, part of what I was, you know, why I'm interested in swimming around in the space that Stan makes possible here, and what's possible with talking to you, David and Hilary. And I know we have many more questions. Perhaps we can copy them down and stay in touch with some people afterwards. But we should, I think, wrap up and say thank you very much to Hilary and David for spending time with us today to talk about crazy big ideas.
Thank you. Great idea to put this on.
And yeah, have a look at David's blog, Climate Code Red, and at Hilary's Marooned on Mars podcast. And there's another seminar in this series next week, and the exhibition is on for a little bit longer if you're here in Wollongong. So with that, I'll say thanks to everybody on the Zoom and in the room for being with us today. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Thank you.
Or
Bye-bye, Hilary. Bye, David.
Bye, and thanks to Lucas. Bye.